Luis, can you come up? Right. Good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to Lisbon, to the Calouste Guggenheim Foundation, and to the opening session of our conference. We realize this is Luis Balula, I am Olivia Vina, Andrea Ricci. We've been the organizers and those who've been emailing you for almost a year. We are really delighted that you could make it, and we hope you have a fantastic 2 days in this really beautiful setting. Unfortunately, the president of the foundation could not be with us this morning, but we are really grateful that they have hosted our conference here, and they have really been very supportive. I also wish to thank, on behalf of the organizing committee, the European Commission, and in particular our project that is funded by the European Commission, URBACHINA, and whose coordinator, François Gipoulou, has kindly accepted to be here today to open our conference. We also wish to thank very much for the support that we've received by the Science and Technology Foundation of Portugal and the Museum of Natural History that will host tonight's dinner. There are endless names I would like to list of people who have contributed throughout the year to help us in organizing this conference. They are around and we will be meeting them today and tomorrow. But as you know, this is a huge teamwork, and I'm really grateful to everybody who's made this project and conference possible. But most importantly, I want to welcome the 27 countries that you represent, and I hope you have a very pleasant and very inspiring 2 days with us. Welcome.
"40 years, it's not a long time in the history in a city, unless there are enormous technological advances or severe natural catastrophes. I believe that in 2050, Lisbon will be a consequence of what the city is today and the strategies we adopt for the problems we face today." So what are Lisbon's most significant problems? Let's start by looking back and quickly analyze the last 40 years. The population has decreased by 1/3, and a quarter of the population is over 65 years old. The metropolitan area has spread in various directions, but without any planned structure. The way in which people move around the city and the means of transport available have changed, with a significant decrease in the use of public transport and an increased use of the private car. There has been an increase on social inequality and the loss of social and territorial cohesion. The economic structure has changed considerably, the industrial sector having lost its importance while being replaced by service industries. New technologies have developed very quickly and play an increasingly important role. Experiments has been carried out in new forms of governance, and new practice has been introduced. The financial model used for the construction changed radically and became based in cheap credit. The changes that occurred during the last 40 years took us to the present time, and today Lisbon faces 3 main problems: desertification, aging, and climate changes. About this desertification, contrary to the major cities in the world, Lisbon population is not growing. In fact, the Portuguese population has been getting smaller, and Lisbon has problems of desertification and aging. The desertification of Lisbon and the sprawl of the metropolitan area is the result of the combination of 4 main factors: a change in housing finance policy leading to the access to cheap and easy credit for home buyers, the housing rents which has been frozen from the Second World War until 2013, causing serious negative impacts on the rental market for decades. Freezing house rents was a decision with good intentions to solve a serious housing crisis, but it ended having a negative impact on the city and the metropolitan area. Real estate investment has been moving away from maintenance to new construction and from the city center to the periphery, in part because of the frozen housing rents. New roads, cheaper cars and credit have leading to an increase in the use of private cars to detriment of public transports, creating a boom of private cars and allowing for a commuting life. The city needs to be adapted to meet the needs of this new reality. About aging, the desertification of the city, combined with Portugal's birth rate, one of the lowest in the world, results in 1/4 of Lisbon residents being over 65 years old. And this number it's growing. If nothing is done, in 2030, we'll have 27% of the population with more than 75 years old. Demography in Lisbon is therefore a serious problem for reasons which are diametrically opposed to what is happening in the most parts of the world where populations are growing and with a high proportion of young people. About climate changes. As a source of greenhouse gas emissions, cities have a huge relevance to the climate change issue. Petrol fuel cars are the major culprits. Lisbon, where only 550,000 people actually live, receives more than 600,000 commuters every day. The majority of these come in private cars. In Lisbon, 2 out of 3 cars in circulation come from outside the city. As I said in the beginning, I believe that unless there are enormous technological advances or severe natural catastrophes, in 2050, Lisbon will be a consequence of what the city is today and the strategies we adopt for the problems we face. These are the strategies we have been adopting or need to be adopted. To reverse the desertification of Lisbon, we need to take decisions at different levels. At the national level, adopting public housing policies aimed to attracting young people to live in the city center. Encouraging the rehabilitation of existing buildings, supporting public transport and electric mobility, stimulating the rental market. At the regional level, bringing together urban planning and mobility planning, making choices and establishing priorities, and not to have a plan as we have, like a sponge which absorbs the interests of each individual municipality. We need an elected regional government because we don't have it. At the local level, we need to use new methodologies of planning and urban management which bring together a strategical vision, planning according to objectives, and a partnership in a win-win strategy. To adapt city to the elders, we need, or to the aging population, in terms of, we need to prepare the city in terms of accessibility of 2 buildings, safe and comfortable and attractive sidewalks, and pedestrian mobility, to promote the integration of facilities for different generations, and most of all, to support a more active aging process using the capacity of the elderly population to work and to consume within the city economy. To fight climate changes and greenhouse emissions, we need to reduce the number of vehicles entering the city every day. To promote a shift towards a greater use of public transports, bicycles and walking, support the progressive implementation of electrical mobility. New roads These objectives can only be implemented with a strong leadership since they go against the habits and cultural values of a whole generation, which was the first one to have a general access to the private car, and who feel that we are restricting their recently acquired freedom of movement. It forced the municipality to redesign streets to give a clear priority to public transports, pedestrians and bicycles, while reducing space available for cars to both circulate and to park. Affect the existing business and service operating in the city, who considered the slogan "no car, no business" to be an absolute truth. Go against the interest of car lobby. Who is in our side in this revolution? Citizens that don't have their own car, mainly the old and the young, who represents more than 2/3 of the population. City residents because they gain more space to drive and park their own cars. Citizens who are more environmentally conscious and better informed about the climate change, the harmful effect for public health of car pollution, and the benefits of walking and cycling in the fight against sedentarism and obesity. Public transport operators who gain efficiency of service and increase in demand. Citizens who discover a new way of using the public space, now free of cars. Owners of traditional shops and tourist operators who appreciate a more beautiful and attractive city. To implement this profound transformation in urban mobility, we must be able to develop a coordinated mobility and urban planning policies, redesign the public transport network, control parking and manage the streets efficiently, invest in improving public space, giving back to pedestrian space that have been sacrificed to cars, sometimes violently, for the last 50 years. Adopting the policies mentioned before, it is not an easy process, and this ambitious plan forced the municipality to develop a capacity for negotiation, provide explanations of its objectives and expected results, persevere in the reduction of conflicts and have the determination to carry out unpopular measures, implement some rehabilitation of public spaces to allow citizens to understand the advantage of this plan, monitor the mobility system in order to allow permanent adjustments when needed. In conclusion, a strategy for change needs alliance, new methodologies to inform and to negotiate with the various stakeholders, and a system for monitoring these changes. Until now, I centered my intervention in Lisbon. The cities are all different. The history of each one will determine its future in the next few decades, and its priorities are all different. But there are many aspects common to most cities, such as the need of a new working methods, forms of governing and of governance and accountability, scarcity of resources, and changes in lifestyle. We need to perfect working methods in order and in order to do so, we need new methods which allow us to anticipate tendencies and possible negative effects which need to be corrected before becoming irreversible. It's the case of the finance of housing, the decisions that has been taken in Portugal 40 years ago. We need to have global and sectoral strategic visions, planning according to objectives and programs of interventions which can be adjusted in the light of changes in context. But at the same time, we need to have stable regulation to guarantee citizens' rights, but those regulations must be adjustable to allow for unexpected opportunities. We need new instruments of permanent monitoring in order to allow policies to be adjusted, to remove obstacles, and to overcome blockage. The new form of governance and accountability are needed. The contribution of cities to development, the magnitude and complexity of the problems to be solved locally, and the means to do so require a new relationship between central and local governments. On the other hand, the proximity between citizens and local government implies a new culture, new working methods, and new ways of operating. The mayor of São Paulo says the state is responsible for what happens inside the house, employment policies, the distribution of wealth, taxes, etc., while the mayor is responsible for everything which happens outside the door: water supply, transport, street cleaning, schools, etc. But obviously, everything is tightly connected. To respond to the needs of and aspirations of the electorate, a new relationship between the national government and local authorities is needed in order to transfer power and competence to the municipalities. Public policies decided at national level need to be agreed in conjunction with local authorities. Cities need to assume a new role, becoming a new player at national and international level. The medias and social network plays an increasingly important role in the creation of new mass movements resulting from single issues campaigns, which can sometimes result in violence. Similarly, there is now an increased consciousness by citizens of their rights, the identification of new urban rights and environment concerns. In conjunction, these issues from a new reality that local government need to integrate into daily practice in order to listen to the electorate and to confront the problems before they get out of hand. This new governance and accountability of representatives is changing the relationship between the elected and the electorate, planning with the people and not just planning for the people is a new culture. It is clear in process such as the participatory budget or the neighborhood regeneration. Another important theme for the future of cities is the results of scarcity of resources. The scarcity of arable land, food reserves, drinking water, energy, physical space, housing, social facilities, human and financial resources is more than a reality. It is a starting point for proper management. The scarcity of resources will force us to make the best use of the existing resources, allowing them in a fair way. In Lisbon, the best use of resources is exemplified in the reuse and rehabilitation of void buildings, a denser occupation of urban areas and public buildings. Does it make sense to only use a school building for 7 hours a day? Public-private partnership are good ways to mobilize resources, giving that public interests will be guaranteed with the correct distribution of risks and benefits. New tools have been developed in order to redirect investment in accordance with public interest objectives, such as the fiscal policy and the non-financial incentives, such as the provision of credits for construction. It is mandatory to overcome the blockage that has been caused by the private ownership of land, with mechanisms for the distribution of costs and benefits of urbanization, and gaining equity in the transformation of land from agriculture to urban uses. Finally, the most difficult aspect to predict is the change in lifestyle which will take place by 2050. Who could have imagined 40 years ago what the effect on our daily life would be on the introduction of mobile phones and internet? Of the improved use of resources of time, space, and cross-referring of data, of the changes in the location of activities, and of the potential impacts of the improved management and monitoring of movement of people, merchandise, and vehicles. How will regions and cities react to the explosion of temporary city users and short break tourism? What will the mobility be like with the reinvention of the urban car, the capsule, the remote control of traffic, and the automatic control of movements as the pooling? In 2050, life in cities will certainly be different. And there will be changes that result from events and advances we can't predict. In 40 years, our cities must be able to expand by transforming their macro cities concepts in micro neighborhood scale. We should return to a more human scale city, creating the conditions for our citizens to live, work, and study close to each other. Our government must move closer to citizens, dealing side by side with their everyday problems. Our neighborhoods should be set the standard of a new sustainable city. In my opinion, only this way cities could be able to face this huge challenge in the next 40 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed for this incredibly comprehensive and inspiring presentation, which serves perfectly as a crisscrossing introduction to the entire program. We could have not hoped better to touch upon all the variety of topics that will be discussed in the various sessions. So again, thank you once more. Let me open the floor for a few questions.
University of Technology, the Netherlands. I would like to ask you two questions. The first is related to the urban right. I think it's quite important that the city in 2050 belongs to the young people. But I'm wondering, what is the economic strength of Lisbon, and how can you attract the young people to stay in the city? What do you think? What kind of reasons do you want the young people to stay in Lisbon? And the second, I want to ask, you have quite a comprehensive view towards the future, how the development should be. I wonder, what is the role of the market players? Do they share the role, the views of the government? And what do you think their role can be played in this whole picture? Thank you.
First of all, I will say that to attract young people, it's the main challenge we have in the future. As I explained, we have several problems. Aging, it's one of them. So generally, Portuguese population, it's become each time more aging. And so to attract young people, we need to think about foreigners. We need to think to fix here Portuguese young people that live to find employment abroad. So we need to develop the economy to avoid that people leave the city, the young people leave the country, even to other countries. And at the same time, we need to develop an economy that can attract young people from other countries to fix in Portugal. The tendency, the demographic tendency of Portugal, it's till 2050, we'll lose population. So we need to have a perspective for the economic in the future with developing entrepreneurship to work really with young people to create opportunities to fix young people coming from outside in Portugal. We have, I will say, very good location situation. We have landscape fantastic, very good climate, very good strategical location in the relations between Europe, South America, Africa. And so we can be a gate from Europe, but at the same time a gate for the countries of the South. And that role, it's very important to increase a new economy in Portugal, to develop, and only with the development of this new economy we can fix young people and to allow them to stay in Portugal and not to go abroad, and at the same time to try to attract young people from other countries to fix here in Portugal. And if they come to Portugal, Lisbon and the metropolitan area of Lisbon had exceptional capacity to attract, because it can be one of the best places in the world to live.
And then we move on.
Yeah, I wanted to raise problems for governance and democratic accountability posed by three issues you have mentioned. One, I would say increasing number of people who actually work in the city in daytime actually do not live in the city, and they do not have democratic control over what happens in the city. You rightly pointed out the problem posed by short-term visitors. The number of short-term visitors for large European cities is many times the actual population. So what problem of governance do they pose? The third area is really the city does not have any boundaries. Increasingly, cities actually are boundaryless. So a lot of people who use services actually live outside the perimeter of cities.
I agree with you. It's one of our main challenge. We have, as I explained, 550 inhabitants living in Lisbon. They are the voters. Well, not all of them, but the ones who have more than 18 years old. And but the city receives every day more 600,000 inhabitants. They don't vote here. Of course, that's a problem that exists in many cities because, as you explained, the boundaries of the city are smaller than the real city. So the real Lisbon, it's much bigger than the municipality. But I don't know, and from the moment I don't have an answer, how can we relate with citizens that use the city every day or that come here even in short breaks, how can they participate in the decisions regarding the city? It's really a question that I don't have an answer, but it's really an important question to the future.
Thank you very much indeed. We really enjoyed your talk, and we're grateful for you being here with us.
Yay. Good morning. It is an honor to be presenting here today, and a pleasure always to return to Lisboa, which is certainly one of my favorite cities, and I hope will continue to be one of my favorite cities all the way through to 2050 and beyond. My thanks to the hosts and the sponsors of this event for supporting our explorations of possible futures for cities. Now, my role today is not to offer you research on emerging signals of change or analysis of the implications of patterns of colliding impacts of change. Many of the trends, the drivers that are facing cities, nations, were identified by the speaker before me. Given the diversity of research that all of you will be presenting over the next few days, the conference is already rich in substantive research. I'm really looking forward to hearing all of the papers that have been presented, and I just wish I could be in 5 places at once, I think, for some of the concurrent sessions. My role today is to provide some guidelines for thinking about emergent futures, especially long-term and surprising futures. The further out we go, the greater the field of uncertainty about what the future we end up in will actually be. So thinking 2050, that's at least one full generation away of, in human terms, it is multiple technical and innovation generations away from us. So the possibilities are pretty much wide open for 2050. So my role today is to provide guidelines for thinking about what might emerge. And my hope is that you will use some of these guidelines and some of these thinking tools as you listen to and discuss the presentations in all of the sessions that follow mine. Now there's going to be some bending and moving back and forth here as I... So this is the first thing I learned as a graduate student in future studies. And yes, future studies is an academic discipline. You can get master's degrees in it. You can get PhDs in future studies. So if you're looking for tools, methods, or training, talk to me later at the coffee break. I'm happy to tell you about all the options that are out there. But when I was a grad student, this was the first rule of futures thinking that I was taught. We can't travel forward in time to observe the future and record descriptive data about it. The second rule of thinking was tomorrow will be nothing like today. Even quantitative forecasts must inevitably be taken with a grain of salt, as they are based on assumptions, which are themselves based on mental models and values that we derive from past experiences and our worldviews. Roots in the past create filters and biases in the present if unexamined. If there are no future facts, and if forecasts are problematic, on what is futures research and what I do based? Well, to a very great extent, it's based on the image, the infinity of images about the future, what the future could be, might be, should be, what we're afraid it should be, that are out there, that are in all of your heads. I'm looking at an infinite set of possible images of the future in this room, in all of your minds. The only facts we can collect in the present about the future are the images of the future held by everyone in this room, in each of our organizations, in each of our communities, cities, and nations. We have no directly observed data about the future, but we have an infinity of images. Those images exist in the past. They are in almost every religion, in political ideologies, in all of our literatures, in art, in advertising. They're everywhere. And each of us holds a myriad of images of the future in our imaginations. Sorry. So some of those are old images, some are new, some are steady state stories about the future, some are extrapolative, some are fearful, some are wishful, some are pure fantasy, science fiction. We have all sorts of movies of fantasy futures. Some are surreal. To keep ourselves sane, so it's sort of a continuum of images of the future. And to keep ourselves sane and make day-to-day life manageable, we tend to default, however, to tomorrow will be a lot like today. We tend to default to thinking about stable systems. And cities are a very good example of sort of an embedded infrastructure of stability in many ways. Given that default as a working assumption, it's no wonder that black swans of change, sudden, surprising changes, surge into flight and astonish us. Any image of difference, of a future that is in contrast to our present, critiques that present. It holds a mirror to our assumptions and challenges us to question them. This challenge opens up space for creativity. The future as possibility is the realm of emergence, of actions and adaptive responses that are generating novel outcomes. So, what are the images for city futures that we commonly extrapolate today? The human mind often roots images of the future in what we hope and what we fear, in our rational capacity to extrapolate, and on our creative capacity to imagine. So, for example, which of these images represent your hopes, your fears, what you forecast, and possibly what you are designing? Now, the interesting question is the person sitting next to you thinking the same thing about any of those four images? Are your hopes for the city of the future the fears of the person sitting next to you? Images based on extrapolation abound. Oh, goodness. Hold on a second. Images based on the future of extrapolation abound. Cities are, of course, massive constructs that society has sort of accreted over time like coral. And as such, they have the inertia and the momentum of that mass: architectural mass, infrastructural mass, regulatory mass, capital mass, and the sheer mass of people themselves. More importantly, many of them have the mass of history. Now, here in Europe, you're all thinking, well, all of them have the mass of history. Trust me, European cities have a lot more mass of history than, say, most American cities do, which is why the older the city, the more slowly its fabric can change, because that fabric is its beloved nature. The cities of Europe steward their past as a resource for the future by protecting certain buildings and neighborhoods. The cities of the USA basically have less past to steward, and the sight of 40-year-old buildings imploding to make way for the new is much more common. So despite my comments above about tomorrow being a little like today, being little like today, for cities with deep historical foundations, the sheer momentum of tradition means that a changed tomorrow is likely to be a very long-term future. But then we're thinking about 2050. So there's a lot of scope to change, even for deeply rooted historical infrastructure. So if we're thinking ahead to 2050, we really need to explicitly and deeply challenge our assumptions. And crises provide such challenges. What sort of crises might cities face in the future? What changes might trigger the end of the urban world as we know it? This comparative matrix offers just a few ways in which the world, as we know it, that is, as we take it for granted, might change radically. It organizes them by origin of change. So, for example, global warming, that's already been brought up. Global cooling, a bit more of a wild card. Shifts in life and demography, like the slow decline in fertility worldwide, or famine and starvation as an abrupt change. Shifts in culture or society, decreasing stability and security locally and internationally as people compete for scarce resources, or on a more abrupt change level, mass civil unrest and border regional conflicts. Some of these crises are being faced as we speak by cities all over the world. And then, of course, there's changing the world as we know it via discovery and innovation, often thought of as a more optimistic change, but it still potentially could change all of our assumptions and mental models. So, thinking about changes and crises and challenges by the origin of change versus the speed of change, incremental, rapid, or sudden disruptive wildcard events. And of course, some of these crises could combine to create mega crisis conditions for cities and civilizations as a whole. If you are interested in scholarly studies of such existential risks, as they are now being called, you could look at the work of Nick Bostrom at Oxford's Future of Humanity Institute, or Cambridge University's Center for the Study of Existential Risk, or the Global Catastrophic Risk Institute, or MIT's Future of Life Institute, all of which are looking at some of these big challenges we may face in the future. Now, possible long-term futures that may result include, just as examples, there are more than this, flood, the rapid onset sea level rise scenario that eradicates many coastal cities and recreates others in the spirit of Venice, which itself would well be lost. Inland communities are groaning under the onset of millions of coastal urban environmental refugees fleeing to higher ground. And note that the experience of Hurricane Sandy has made this possible future much more real now to city planners in New York. They've gotten a bit of an experiential foretaste of what might happen. Another possibility is fade. The slow erosion of the urban fabric, both of social interconnections and of the built environment, as Western societies age, and fewer workers are available to support urban economic engines. Labor moves to centers of highest opportunity, leaving some urban areas to languish. You might call this, neo-Detroit, metropolitan governments struggling to maintain basic infrastructure and services. Although I'll point out that this photograph is not actually from Detroit. This photograph is from a building in the middle of Singapore. And I took it particularly because I was caught by how quickly nature can take over from human infrastructure. Another possible outcome is a sustained future, of course. A paradigm shift away from the capitalist world system, so it would still be the end of the world as many people know it. A shift away from the capitalist world system and its consumerist worldview to one focused on cradle-to-cradle recycling, zero carbon, and possibly putting bioscience innovations to use in growing city infrastructure, the city as farm, forest, and fabbing center, renovating the suburbs so that even suburban houses are sort of more self-contained microgenerators of power and processors of their own water. And then transform. Transform is a paradigm shift pulling all assumptions at play. The boundaries between humans, their technologies, and the environment are porous. Humans, as humans, lose their monopoly on intelligence, while new forms of artificial life and artificial intelligence emerge. Lives are long, experience is the currency, education continuous, production and governance open source, and blurred between the local and global, and children are few. Cities can redesign on the fly to suit the needs and whims of their organic and silicon inhabitants. Which of these do you find crazy? Any of them? Which do you find craziest, the most pessimistic, or the most optimistic? Do any of them challenge assumptions or paradigms of how the world works that you take for granted? This list is, of course, merely a general set of examples. Applied future city design requires that we each think crazy about our own cities and in detail. So how do we get crazy and forecast or imagine or explore truly creative and transformative possibilities for cities in 2050? So the next part of my presentation very quickly gives you some thought exercises you can practice while in sessions today and tomorrow. So the first issue is one that is a common first step in forecasting, right? Extrapolation. There's a couple problems with extrapolation, especially if you are trying to extrapolate out to 2050. As I said, the range of uncertainty gets much wider the farther out you go. And also there is basically the problem of Too little data, no future facts. You see, yesterday, no husbands. Today, one husband. As you can see, by late next month, you'll have over 4 dozen husbands. Better get a bulk rate on wedding cake. So the lesson here is beware of straight lines. Change in living systems, particularly in human systems, is neither simple nor ballistic. Why? Because we're curious, creative, inventive, playful, and contrary, addictive, and perverse. We don't tend to operate in straight lines. Change evolves in overlapping waves and turbulence. There's actually a futures tool called the Three Horizons Framework that helps us think through that. The operating assumptions of today are built on the successful responses to past waves of change. Those assumptions create stability, but they also resist change. That's the first horizon. The third horizon is the horizon of the visionaries and the inventors of today that challenge those assumptions, but often in ways that are ultimately unworkable. They disrupt paradigms and perspectives, but they don't necessarily build things. The second horizon is the horizon of entrepreneurs who build on visions to create marketable goods and services. They transform capacity, actual capabilities to do things, and they create new operating assumptions. Now again, one of the problems with straight line thinking is that you may have invented something insanely great, but when you set it free, it will immediately and unpredictably interact with everything else in its context. This image and the sort of slightly farcical little image of the future, description of the future that goes with it, was part of a viral idea exchange 2 years ago called "The Singularity is Boring." That basically says, well, if you extrapolate out 3D printing, spam, and micropayments, you get tribbles that you get billed for as they replicate wildly out of control. 90% of everything is rubbish, and it's all in your spare room. Or someone else's spare room, which you are forced to rent through Airbnb. So, when you work with ideas, you need to think about different kinds of change to imagine complex, evolving change. Try brainstorming the impacts and the impacts of 3 different new ideas you hear discussed today and tomorrow. Ask yourself, what next new thing will the colliding impacts, the combinations of impacts of these 3 changes generate? How will those colliding impacts affect society? What counterintuitive results emerge when a change that's good on a small scale goes global? Next, beware the lone wolf future. All of you out there that are fans of the singularity, this is the problem with the singularity. Change is not binary. The future is not monocular. We don't face a single future, no matter how compelling new technologies are or how much momentum they seem to have. Changes generate myriad possible futures. There are multiple emergent futures possible given different initial conditions. Complex interactions of multiple onrushing changes, and a complex context that includes cultural diversity and all of your individual points of view. When someone's inventing something, beware of their original intentions. You've invented a new technology or a new service or a new form of organization. What you designed it to do is not necessarily what your fellow humans will do with it. A diagnostic tool like the X-ray can become an artist's medium, or children will turn it into a game, or like so many new media, someone will use it as an avenue for porn. Hey, that's what the internet turned into, right? Let's be honest. All right, so where do unintended consequences arise? They arise everywhere. They arise in every arena of human activity. This is something called the Verge Conceptual Practice Framework for Future Studies. And it basically says, let's think about change in terms of how we define things, our mental models, our paradigms, in terms of how we relate to each other, how communities relate to each other, how they relate to the government, how nations relate to each other, how we relate to the environment, how we connect with each other, which is not just hardware. Connecting with each other is also art and language and our mediums of exchange. how we create goods and services, or how we create the next generation of citizens, our patterns of our consumption, and also importantly, how we get rid of things, how we acknowledge that maybe some mental models are obsolete. So what that leads us to thinking about is how we perceive reality. So the next thinking tool is to be aware of your lenses. The people around you are likely to be using very different filters. How do you see the world? Who else sees the world that way? What are the embedded values, myths, and metaphors of your assumptions? How do different values, myths, and metaphors drive responses to your inventions, your ideas, your policy initiatives, your new plans for the city, your new transport system? How do we think through that? There is a futures tool called Causal Layered Analysis, CLA for short. And basically it talks about what the buzz is about. What do the common people say? Are they complaining about traffic? Are they complaining about waste in the city and the bad waste disposal? Are they complaining about the education systems? Are they happy about something? What's the buzz? But you can't just work at the level of changing buzz. You have to think about the technical explanations, the system interconnections. And you can't just invent a new system either, because essentially what you need to do is work down to the level of worldviews, and you need to engage with and develop different worldviews. You have to ask people to re-perceive the world with a different metaphor or a new myth. New metaphor or myth for what we want cities to be in 2050. To sort of reset the framing, the mental framing we all have about what a city could be. Ask the next 5 people you meet what their myths or metaphors are for the worlds and futures that we're inventing for cities. So, what metaphors do we use to think about the city? As we move from the feudal to the industrial era, yes, it's working. Sorry, this was what was stalling the whole slide deck before. One metaphor for the city was mechanical, a collection of moving parts and interlocking infrastructure, because the industrial age was all about mechanics. But we're now moving from the industrial age to the information age. So is the new metaphor streams of digital data? Is that what you're thinking about? And what's your image of the smart city? Is it cities that are being planned, like Songdo? And what's beyond the digital age? 2050, that's a long way off. Digital technologies will become mature, they'll be everywhere. What's beyond that? A lot of people are saying that what we'll see next is the age of biotech or of living systems. Is the metaphor for a city in 2050 that of a cultivated and vigorously growing plant? Is the first signal of the proliferation of vertical gardens? And city infrastructure may be grown via arbor structure as a longer range example. And then, even more intriguing, what's the age beyond the biological? The noosphere? Are we heading towards a nootropic city? Just recently, last month, an international team of neuroscientists and robotics engineers have demonstrated the first direct remote brain-to-brain communication between 2 humans located 5,000 miles away from each other and communicating via the internet. What will city infrastructure need to be to support that civilization? In addition to these tools for futures thinking, some terrific design tools and online platforms also exist for creating and collecting provocative images of the future. Design card games are another way to create crazy difference and unusual futures by adding a stochastic element to the design or a creativity-forced tension by contrast. 2 examples are card games created by design schools. One is the Art Center College of Design's Mobility Vision integration project that allows you to deal a hand of cards describing, in the sum of its combined trends, a potential future. The accompanying design deck specifies the design goal, customer niche, and design constraints. Participants then design a new artifact for the future context. More recently, from the Ontario College of Art and Design, Situation Lab's The Thing from the Future card deck creates hands with 4 types of cards. Art cards describing possible futures, terrain cards describing contexts or topics, mood cards describing emotions that an object might evoke, and object cards specifying the object to be designed. Details of the future are then explored at the level of the artifacts in use in daily life. So what will be the artifacts around us in cities in 2050? How might those create a surprising range of new human activities and potential impacts? If crazy futures are unusual, assumption-challenging, and perspective-busting futures, then collecting and actively listening to a wide variety of images and narratives about possible futures is critical. Crowdsourcing. 2 innovative platforms for collecting public narratives on change and impacts that point to emerging futures have recently been developed. Cognitive Edge's SenseMaker software basically asks people to share their stories and narratives to illustrate some aspect of a change or an emerging future, and then to signify their story's most important meanings in relation to that topic. It then compiles the story into basically a landscape of meaning that highlights both agreed futures and futures in dispute. Futurescaper lets people share emerging issues of change and explore cascades of impacts from those changes. The software supports participants in linking changes and impacts to generate emergent futures in a very collaborative online workspace that also visualizes those interconnections and the emerging system to let people take a look at it and critique it. As diverse participants share and work through the collective narratives and mind maps, novel insights emerge about possible futures. So, I've galloped through this, coming to the end. In sum, as you go through the next 2 days, are you maximizing the diversity and complexity of your thinking about the future? Are you collecting and considering all the images of the future in all of our cultures? As, 27 countries? Yes? A lot of cultures represented here. The diversity of cultural perspective alone should generate a massive amount of creativity. So, collecting and considering all the images of the future in our cultures and in our cities' residents' minds. And are you identifying what you take for granted and challenging those assumptions? So, one final tool. It's called assumption reversal. First, list everything you take for granted about cities. This was just a little rough back-of-the-envelope version that I came up with. Everything you take for granted about cities, they're static. They sit in one place, they don't move. Man-made materials, concentrated, centralized utilities, distinct boundaries between urban and rural, top-down administration. Kind of a past view of the city, but still true in a lot of places. Next, this is just a logical operation. It's not what you think. It's not what you think about cities. The next step is state those assumptions as their logical opposites, whether it makes sense at the moment or not, opposites seem possible or not. So, what are the opposites? Well, static permanent to mobile and temporary, man-made materials to organic materials or built environment grown, like coral reefs. There are actual people doing research on that. Concentrated centralized utilities, decentralized microgenerated power, and decentralized water processing. Distinct boundaries between the urban and the rural, wild cities like that picture I showed you from Singapore, metropolitan agriculture, vertical gardens, top-down administration, bottom-up adaptive decision-making. There's a whole session this afternoon where I'm looking forward to hearing some examples about exactly that. So, that middle column is a logical exercise. The last column is actual research. Can you find emerging signals, weak signals of change, that might make those seemingly impossible ideas possible by 2050? As an example, if we add together ATN Mobile's design for electric self-driving cars that are essentially living rooms or studio apartments on wheels, with a solar roadways concept of highways paved with solar collectors and the notion of wireless inductive charging, then one possible imaginable future for a city is that of a pop-up swarm city. the city as emergence, as the temporary embodiment of a creative desire. And some of you may recognize that bottom picture, which is Burning Man. The world, as we know it, cannot be changed without changing our thinking. I look forward to all of you changing mine. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Wendy, for these crazy images.
Wait, and also thank you to Olivia for donating her computer so that those 3 animated clips could run. Yay.
Thank you very much for these images, and even more for translating them into challenges for our mind. So we are running a little bit late, but I'm sure we can erode the coffee break slot of at least 5 or 8 minutes and take a few questions. Yes, there's one question there. Coming.
Hi, I'm Sarah Benhammer from Technical University of Denmark. My question is, do you work with municipalities, and what are the main successes and challenges? Do you have any collaboration?
Any lessons learned?
Yeah.
Okay. As two of the projects that I can cite, one is a past project that I worked on for the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea in London. The other is that I am currently working with a group of people on transport scenarios for Stockholm, and as part of that we're generating alternative futures for Stockholm for 2030 or 40. And wow, I'm really hoping to absorb as many ideas as possible from all of you over the next 2 days. One of the lessons that we learned, and I'm going to take Kensington and Chelsea first, is Kensington and Chelsea, for those of you that don't know London very well or the UK, is literally the richest borough in London and possibly the richest community in the whole of the UK. It is where everybody wealthy lives, and not just UK wealthy, but global wealthy people. What that means, speaking of desertification, is that a lot of the very high rent housing stock there isn't occupied except for like 1 week at Christmas when the uber wealthy, global wealthy come in and do their Christmas shopping for the kids, right? And one of the problems with it is that when you get a group of people together, to reflect back on some of the methods that it sounded like URBACHINA was using, when you get a group of people together and say, let's discuss a vision for your city in the future. We were doing visioning work with them, not scenario work. These very well-off, privileged, entitled people looked at us and went, we don't have to vision a better future for Kensington and Chelsea. It's already as good as it gets. And we went, wow, no. And what we had to do was add into that conversation a scenario exercise to say, if you continue to think that you don't have to think about your future, here are 4 alternative places that you may end up. And here are the kinds of not thinking decision paths that take you to those 4 different futures. And essentially it was sort of a tough love version of future studies, because we were saying, we're going to put your feet to the fire and make you think about unpleasant outcomes, or outcomes that you would think would be unpleasant, to make you understand that yes, you do have to constantly be revisioning what you want your city to be, because while you're standing there, and this is sort of the lesson of the 3 Horizons framework, if you're standing there assuming stability and assuming that you've hit all your goals, and you've got a set of operating assumptions based on that, if you keep those assumptions static, they will become less and less fit for purpose over time. That is why that first horizon curve goes down, because they are less and less fit for purpose in a context of dynamic, evolving change. So you always have to reconsider your assumptions. And so one of our challenges there was that we had to figure out a way to bring that into the conversation, that if you don't make decisions about the future, other people are. And just getting people to a state of awareness about change. And that's often the most difficult part. I do a lot of horizon scanning, and the issue of getting people to understand that there are not only the strong trends they see around them of, let's say aging, but there are the weak signals of change that will introduce changes that will deform strong signals. So when I think about aging, I don't think about the problem of having an entire city filled with decrepit people. About 10 years ago, I started thinking about the issue of vigorous aging and having an entire city filled with 80-year-olds who wanted to bungee jump or zip line or keep working and not make space at the top of their organizations for the younger people who obviously want to be promoted up. So they start hitting the ceilings of all these vigorous seniors who just aren't going away, right? You're going to have to shuffle us off the board somehow, young people. How are you going to do that? Nowadays, what I think about in terms of aging is, well, I was hoping to assume vigorous aging because I'm getting pretty aged myself. And now I'm getting worried that what's going to really derail that trend is the fact that of antibiotic-resistant organisms. And so if any of you are looking forward to a future where in 10, 15 years, where you're assuming you're going to need any kind of surgery at all, joint replacements, arterial bypasses, very difficult to do surgery when none of the antibiotics work. All of a sudden, you know, we might see lifespan collapse in some cases. Now, it's my business to float out different ideas and to sort of play with different emerging changes. And a lot of what I spend time doing is not, in fact, making presentations, and I'm drawing this one to a close, but getting groups of people together in workshops and using a lot of these creative tools. And I come in and say, I've done research on emerging changes and on some of the big trends of change. Let's all get together, think through their possible impacts, and think about what it means to us, either to our organization or to our products and services or to the infrastructure of our city or livability in our city. So the lessons learned, though, is getting people just to be aware that they are all operating in a context of dynamic change. And that means that you can't take anything for granted, especially the further forward you're thinking into the future. So 2050, get creative. We could go anywhere from here. And that's a good thing, that we could go anywhere from here.
Any more questions? I have a small one for you.
A small one, okay.
Going back to one of your early slides when you showed wildcards, I always wonder how comes that in most exercises, when one talking about wildcards, most of what comes out are catastrophic events. It's very seldom that you see wildcards which are somehow verged on the optimistic side of future thinking. Can you comment on this?
There are actually a lot of wildcards about that, and that's, quite frankly, that's why I had that last comment about disruptive innovations. So transformation in a good sense. I do need to specify, however, that I took that table from a research paper I was asked to create on possible extinction scenarios. Now, there's a lot of research on that, and one of the interesting things is, you'll be happy to note, this is kind of optimistic, we're actually really hard to extinguish, to make go extinct. A whole bunch of researchers were asked to come up with plausible extinction scenarios, and they basically said we can't. The human race is just too inventive. We'll figure out some way about it. So that's the good news. The other good news is, yeah, there are a lot of sort of wild cards for science, technology. And if, in fact, you go to, say, the Singularity website, those people are tracking every conceivable wild card, you know, every conceivable possibility for fantastic technological change. You find it at Singularity. There are a number of people that are doing the same thing in terms of spiritual transcendence. Barbara Marx Hubbard famously has spent her lifetime doing that, the Institute of Noetic Sciences. So there are people that are looking at or looking for wildcard possibilities that are upside possibilities in science, technology, spirituality, human thinking, human creativity. It's just that, quite frankly, the deck is definitely loaded on the downside. We are living in scary times, although I'm sure, especially as I know there are plenty of delegates from China in the world, I'm sure people have been saying we are living in scary times as far back as 3,000 years ago in the early days in China. So thank you very much. I will be here both days, and I'm looking forward to talking to all of you.
Thank you again, Wendy. Thank you.